Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes.
Very well. I see the number increasing. We are at 275. Usually, Chelsea, how many do attend this lecture usually?
Around 380.
380, okay. Yeah, the number is moving up fast. So great. So that we don't take long before we get started, I'm aware our Muslim brothers and sisters ask that I try finish a bit earlier so that we give them time to go and do their prayers, which I'll honor. I'll try and finish probably 15 minutes to 1. And therefore, because already we are 5 minutes into the lecture, allow me to get started right away. So this morning, therefore, you'll have about 1 hour, 40 minutes. After 1 hour, I'll give you 5 minutes break, and then we resume the other bit. So yesterday, I started on pulmonary circulation. Incidentally, I cannot enlarge my slides. The minute I enlarge, then I have a problem moving from one slide to the other. So bear with the smaller size. We did pulmonary circulation, and we said today we are going to start on diffusing capacity of respiratory membrane. Diffusing capacity of respiratory membrane. I hope the noise of the background is not so disturbing so that I move on. There's a point. When we talk about diffusing capacity of respiratory membrane, there's a concept related to diffusion of gases across the respiratory membrane. And therefore, we ask ourselves 5 questions. Question number 1, what is the respiratory membrane? 2, what are the layers that make respiratory membrane? 3, how would the gases diffuse through the respiratory membrane? 4, what would be the rate of diffusion of these gases? And 5, how do we measure the diffusing capacity of respiratory membrane? Now, looking at this sketch, what I wanted to demonstrate with this sketch is this, that from atmosphere, we are breathing in, and our interest is to take in oxygen. And the air carrying oxygen in it, which is about 21% constituent of the atmospheric air, that is oxygen, comes through the nose or the mouth. And of course, at this point, the air is pre-warmed from room temperature to almost 32 to 35 degrees thereabout. Dust particles are trapped and water vapor is added. That's called humidification. 3 things: dust particles attracted, the air is pre-warmed, and vapor is added to it, humidification. Then it passes through the nasal and oral cavity. Then it gets to the trachea, and the trachea bifurcates at the carina of trachea to give rise to primary bronchioles, which bifurcates to give rise to secondary bronchioles. And finally, this division every minute into two, every distance into two, does so about 22 times before you reach the terminal bronchioles. When you reach the terminal bronchioles, then you get to the alveolar sac. And I want to, therefore we have the right lobe of the lung and the left lobe of the lung. And I want you to appreciate the position of the diaphragm in relation to the structures of the lungs. I want to pick this bit here and put it in the next slide. It's more of magnifying it. And you find that at this point, you have, okay, I've demonstrated here, the intention is to demonstrate that they have the right lobe of the lung and the left lobe of the lung. The right lobe of the lung has three sections: the right superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the right inferior lobe. Whereas the left lobe of the lung has only two lobes, the superior and the inferior. The middle one here look like is lacking, and God in his infinite wisdom decided so that we get what we call a cardiac notch. This is a place where the heart is inserted, the position of the heart. And I would want you also, remembering what I was talking about yesterday, the relationship between the position of the heart and the parts of the lobe of the lungs, the superior, middle, and the lower, vis-a-vis the cardiac notch. Now, the terminal bronchiole leads to the alveolar sac. And I want to magnify the alveolar sac and have a look at it. This is how the alveolar sac look like. The proximity of the pulmonary artery bringing in deoxygenated blood, indicated using the blue color, deoxygenated blood. Then it anastomosis, and in a very close proximity with the surface of alveolus, make a mesh that now again joins to the other end to form the pulmonary artery, a pulmonary vein, sorry. And pulmonary vein, of course, is carrying oxygenated blood back to the heart, designated here in white, in a red color. So from nose to the bronchiole, that is the terminal bronchioles, that space, we refer to it as a conducting zone of the respiratory system, conducting zone. And from bronchioles to the alveolus, the terminal bronchiole, that is, to the alveolus, here we refer to it as respiratory zone. It is in the respiratory zone that gases exchange takes place. Whereas in conducting zone, though there is air filling it, gases exchange does not take place there because the thickness of the walls cannot allow gases exchange to take place. So not conducting zone and respiratory zone. And within the conducting zone, I've said there is no gases exchange taking place, and therefore, even though there is air there, That space we refer to it as a dead air space. Dead air space because there is no exchange of gas there. Remember again when Dr. Dean was sharing with you about the gas, the volumes, the gas volumes, he must have mentioned that on average, the tidal volume, the amount of air that you breathe in and out during a normal quiet breathing is about 500 ml of air. Within that 500 ml of air, 150 ml is trapped within the conducting zone. So it's only 350 ml that reaches the respiratory zone. That's important. Now, I want to pick this portion of alveolar, which is in close proximity with the pulmonary capillary, a section of it, and magnify it so that we start now appreciating the arrangement of the alveolar sac and the blood vessel. Alveolar sac and the blood capillary, the pulmonary capillary is here. Now, we have within the surface of alveolar, principally it is made up of a type 1 cell and a type 2 cell. That's the alveolar surface. Type 1 cell is a simple squamous epithelial cell. Simple squamous epithelial cell. And type 2 is what we call a surfactant cell that produces surfactant. Very important in maintaining surface tension, preventing the alveolar from total collapse. And I want you also to appreciate the presence of white blood cells outside, in between the capillaries and the alveolar sac, that space, and also the presence of macrophages within the structure of the alveolus. Anytime a particle gets into the alveolus, and we always say any particle that is less than 5 micrometer in diameter has the ability to be breathed in to the alveolus. Any particles with a diameter less than 5 micrometer has the potential to get into the alveolus. And in that case, what happens is that it is taken out through phagocytosis by the macrophage, alveolar macrophages. All right. This section between alveolar wall and the capillary wall is extremely important, and I want to go into it in the next slide, and that is what we call respiratory membrane. Respiratory membrane, the junction between alveolus and the capillary. As a matter of fact, you read in the textbook is called alveolar capillary junction, ACJ, alveolar capillary junction. And this junction is made up of this number of layers of wall, and it has also been called the blood-gas barrier. The blood-gas barrier, because you find blood in the capillary and the gas in the alveolus. So whenever you see the blood-gas barrier, it means it represents this barrier here, made up of several layers that I'm going to talk about shortly. It is also called alveolar capillary junction. This junction constitutes what we call the respiratory membrane. Respiratory membrane, because oxygen must diffuse from alveolus into the blood, and carbon dioxide must diffuse from the blood through this junction into the alveolus, and therefore this is called respiratory membrane. And within this respiratory membrane, it has got several barriers, and these barriers, these layers are what we call respiratory membrane barriers. Respiratory membrane barriers. There are 6 in number. I want you to have a look from the inner side of alveolus for a molecule of oxygen to dissolve, to diffuse from here, alveolus, and pass through the barrier. Then it pass through into the blood. It has to pass through the respiratory membrane. And therefore, it has to pass through several barriers. Barrier number 1 is the fluid and the surfactant lining the surface, the inner surface of the alveolus. Next, the oxygen molecule, once it has passed through the fluid surfactant layer, it must pass through the alveolar epithelium. Once it passes through the alveolar epithelium, then it finds the third barrier, which is epithelial basement membrane. Epithelial basement membrane. Then, once it passes there, it must pass through the interstitial space before it encounters the capillary basement membrane, and then the capillary endothelium itself, before it can get into the blood in the capillary. So principally, the main barriers here are 6. Number 1, fluid and the surfactant. Number 2, alveolar epithelium. Number 3, epithelial basement membrane of the alveolar. Then interstitial space, and then capillary basement membrane and capillary endothelium. And that oxygen molecule will have reached into pulmonary capillary inside of it. By now, I expect that you know that the pulmonary capillary are usually very thin, such that the red blood cells move like they are squeezing themselves through. And therefore, the blood plasma is not necessarily a barrier. However, it has to get through the red blood cell membrane for that oxygen molecule to bind into the hemoglobin. So you can see the challenges that that oxygen molecule has to overcome to get to bind to to hemoglobin in the red blood cell. In the same manner, carbon dioxide has to encounter the same barriers from this other side of the blood capillary to come to the alveolar. And therefore, these respiratory membrane barriers becomes very important, because in disease situations, in pathologies, we find there are quite a number of pathologies that interferes with that barrier. In essence, the barrier is very thin in terms of 0.1 to 0.5 micrometer in diameter. You can imagine if this barrier was to increase in size, this distance was to increase in size, it means it would take longer for oxygen to diffuse. If this barrier, if this surface was to shrink for any reason, you get a scar here, and therefore the surface is scarred and the oxygen cannot pass through there, and therefore you're reducing surface area, then you compromise the diffusion and many other issues that will arise, and you're going to have a look at it. Therefore, in summary, there are layers of the respiratory membrane that we refer to as respiratory membrane barriers. These are 6 in number. 1, we've talked about a layer of fluid lining the alveolus and containing surfactant. 2, we've talked about the alveolar epithelium composed of thin epithelial cells. 3, we've talked about an epithelial basement membrane. 4, a thin interstitial space between the alveolar epithelium and the capillary membrane. 5, a capillary basement membrane that in many places fuses with the alveolar epithelial basement membranes. Number 6, the capillary endothelial membrane. I have also added number 7, the RBC membrane, because it's also a barrier to itself. Okay. Therefore, there are factors that influence the rate of diffusion across the respiratory membrane. There are 6 in number. 1 is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. That we've talked about 0.5 micrometer in diameter. If it were to increase by, for example, swelling, what we call pulmonary edema, or there is interstitial lung disease, it increases in thickness. Therefore, the distance that the molecule of oxygen will travel to get to RBC increases. So the bigger the distance or the thickness, the slower the rate of diffusion. Number 2, the surface area available for diffusion. The greater the surface area, the higher the rate of diffusion. There are disease conditions like pulmonary emphysema that destroy alveolar septa, leading to decreasing alveolar surface area, and therefore compromises gas diffusion. The pressure differences from alveolar side to the blood side. If the higher the pressure difference, the higher the rate of diffusion. And the lower the difference, the lower the rate of diffusion. 4, solubility of gases. Different gases have different solubilities. For example, carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble than oxygen in a fluid, like surfactant, and those other fluids there. That's what we call solubility coefficient. So the more soluble the gas is, the higher the rate of diffusion of that gas. Number 5, the molecular weight of a gas. The higher the molecular weight, the slower the diffusion. Because it's heavier, it moves slowly. And number 6, we talk about temperature. Of course, the temperature usually in a person who is healthy, normal, is regulated. Talk about that 7 degrees centigrade. But if that temperature of the air going in was to be increased artificially in a way, then it would mean the higher the temperature, the higher the rate of diffusion. These 6 factors simplified by what we call the Fick's law of diffusion. The Fick's law of diffusion. And before I give the equation that denotes the Fick's law of diffusion, I want you to note that out of these 6 factors, factor number 4, 5, and 6 are constants and depends. For example, solubility of a gas is a constant and it is specific to specific gas. Carbon dioxide has its own solubility coefficient that does not change. oxygen the same, nitrogen the same. Every gas has got its own solubility coefficient. Molecular weight, every gas has its own unique molecular weight that does not change. And temperature can be held constant if need be. Solubility of a gas and its molecular weight has got a relationship where if you divide the solubility with the square root of molecular weight, you get what we call diffusion coefficient of a gas. Diffusion coefficient of a gas is equal to the solubility of a gas divided by the square root of the molecular weight of that gas. That's a factor that is called diffusion coefficient. And if you look at your textbook of Guyton, there's a table that shows the diffusion coefficient of various gases. And they are derived by dividing the solubility of a gas divided by the square root of the molecular weight of the same gas. And you get various diffusion coefficient, such that, for example, oxygen is given 1, and every other gas is given a factor in relation to oxygen. All right. And when you bring in the factor that is temperature, you can hold it constant at any temperature you want. And therefore, when you come to the Fick's law of diffusion, it says this: the rate of diffusion is equal to a constant that you multiply by the area of for gases exchange, the area I've talked about for gases exchange, and multiply by the difference in partial pressure of gas on either side of the barrier to diffusion. That is alveolar partial pressure of that gas minus the blood capillary blood partial pressure of the same gas. That's the pressure difference divided by the thickness or the distance I've talked about. Note this constant is constant because diffusion is called diffusion constant because it depends on the solubility of the gas, the molecular weight, and the temperature, which I was laboring to explain. That equation is what we call the Fick's law of diffusion. Fick's law of diffusion. The rate of diffusion is equal to a constant which is determined by the solubility of a gas, the molecular weight of a gas, and the temperature of that gas, times the surface area of for gases exchange, times the difference in partial pressure of that gas between the alveolus and the blood, all divided by the thickness of the barrier. That's why I was taking time to explain this barrier here, because it has got significance when it comes to the rate of diffusion of oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out from the blood into the alveolar, and it gets affected so much in pathological states like pneumonitis, like pulmonary edema, like fibrosis, etc. And this understanding will help you a lot in your third year when you start discussing pathology and the pathogenesis of diseases. Hope we are together up there. Allow me to check on some comments. So does it mean hypothermic patient is likely to develop hypoxia? Definitely yes. because if the temperature in hypothermia, of course, you're talking about low temperatures, it will affect breathing. The reason people who drown or you are put in a tank that is very cold, one of the things that will happen other than lowering the basal metabolic rate is to affect the diffusion of air in and out of the lungs. A minute, please. All right, looking at the message still. Is the diffusion constant K on the Fick's law different from diffusion coefficient? Let me answer this very clearly. I said the diffusion coefficient that is tabulated in your textbook are determined by dividing the solubility coefficient of a gas divided by its molecular square root of its molecular weight. That's give diffusion coefficient. When you factor in the temperature and you hold the temperature constant, then that constitutes diffusion constant, which is K. So diffusion constant is slightly different from diffusion coefficient because diffusion coefficient only factors in solubility of a gas and the molecular weight of that gas. And when you fix constant temperature, then that factor is diffusion constant, which is talked to by the Fick's law of diffusion. Does asthma affect diffusion? We'll go and talk about it after this. Asthma has an issue of inflammation, and inflammation is swelling, and the swelling will increase the area, and also asthma causes bronchial constriction, and therefore reduces the aperture of the bronchioles. We'll talk about it as we move along, don't worry. Diffusion coefficient is only dependent on solubility and molecular weight, correct? Diffusion coefficient is dependent on the 2 plus temperature, really, right? Yeah, very well. I think we are getting one another well. Thank you very much. Allow me to continue for the interest of time. If you have a question, you put it on the chat. Now, question, how do we measure, therefore, the rate of diffusion of a gas through a respiratory membrane? 2, what is the diffusion capacity of a respiratory membrane? And when I talk about diffusion capacity of respiratory membrane, this is the volume of a gas that will diffuse through the membrane each minute for a pressure difference of 1 millimeter mercury. The volume or the amount of gas, the volume of gas that will diffuse through the membrane each minute for a pressure difference of 1 millimeter mercury, that's what determines or indicates the diffusion capacity of respiratory membrane. By the time we answer these 2 questions, we'll be summarizing the question of the diffusing capacity of respiratory membranes. Okay. There's is my slide clear from your side? It's telling me there is a window that I need to close.
The slides are clear.
Okay, very well. Diffusion. Okay, how? Let me repeat this one. The question is this: how do we measure the rate of diffusion of a gas through a respiratory membrane? And before I
Dr. Kilin,
yes.
from your end, do you sometimes see a box that says, please move this window away from the shared
Yeah,
application?
that's the point. That's what I'm seeing.
Oh, okay, we're also seeing that box.
How do I move it?
If you click it, it's not moving?
No, it is not moving. And it's not the first time to see this thing. Like this. It comes and fades. Eh? Please move this window
like
away
appears.
from the shared application. I don't know how to move it away. Anybody who may be in the know of how to move it away?
Oh, okay. Students have suggested you stop sharing, then start sharing again.
Okay, fine. Let me do so. I'll stop sharing. Then I share again. You can see it?
Okay, now the box is gone.
Very well. The wisdom in a community is great. Let me give you a small, I think, not as really a story. If you are to visit, let's say you have a patient who has problem with bronchitis. Bronchitis is a swelling of the bronchial tree because of exposure to an allergen, for example. And over a long period of time, bronchitis can be very nasty in terms of persistent swelling and exudation of fluid. And you find that this person must probably use an inhaler to increase the aperture of bronchial tubes. What we get concerned with after a while is whether this person, when he or she breathes in and out, is that gas able to get into the blood properly? And that question is asking, how is the diffusion of gases, oxygen from alveoli into the blood, and how is the diffusion of carbon dioxide from blood into the alveoli? Is the rate of that diffusion normal, or has it been compromised? So if a patient comes, then we need to measure the rate of diffusion of the respiratory membrane, or rather, is the respiratory membrane okay? That's the question. And if it's okay, then it means the diffusion of gases is okay. If the respiratory membrane has been affected by anything, then we are going to have a problem, and we need to know to what extent is it compromised so that we know what to do, whether to give oxygen under pressure, pressurized oxygen, etc. So the first thing to do is to to test for the integrity of the respiratory membrane. That usually you find it with a specialist called pulmonologists, those who specialized in respiratory system, the chest physicians. And therefore, there is a test they always require. It's not very common, but is there. It is called DLCO. DLCO. DLCO, this one here. DLCO. You ask for a test called DLCO. The simple idea of DLCO, and to many, if you are practicing a general practitioner and you never took time to understand it in class, you may float, because DLCO is a big name. It stands for diffusion limited carbon monoxide test. And we are trying to investigate the integrity of the respiratory membrane. Those barriers, are they working okay, or they are compromised? So the question was, how do we measure the rate of diffusion of gas through a respiratory membrane? We measure it by using DLCO test. And DLCO stands for diffusion limited carbon monoxide test. And we'll see why carbon monoxide, yet we know carbon monoxide is a poisonous gas. But being a poisonous gas is not poisonous until you give to a certain amount. Very small amount is not really, cannot kill you, but you use it medically to determine the diffusion rate through the membrane. And this is a story I've given here to make it easier for you to understand. What I have said is this, that carbon monoxide is used to measure diffusion capacity. Carbon monoxide, not oxygen, not nitrogen, but carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide. Why carbon monoxide? We need to use a gas that will continue diffusing into the pulmonary capillary blood without reaching equilibrium. That is, the partial pressure in the blood does not rise, it is zero. Carbon monoxide, once inhaled, will reach the alveolar, of course, and the partial pressure will increase in the alveolar. It will then diffuse into the pulmonary capillary blood and combine with the hemoglobin rapidly. That's the key word. Since its affinity for hemoglobin is 200 times more than that of oxygen, it does not remain free in plasma. Another important thing, it does not remain free in plasma. Hence, it does not exert partial pressure. You know, gases will exert partial pressure when they are free in plasma, when they are not bound. But the minute they are bound, they do not exert partial pressure in liquids. And therefore, carbon monoxide does not remain free because of this high affinity of hemoglobin towards carbon monoxide. It will bind very quickly, and hence it does not exert partial pressure. And therefore, carbon monoxide, therefore, will not reach equilibrium at any given time. For this reason, therefore, if you are to give it through diffusion only, it is limited to reach equilibrium by diffusion. And for this reason, as long as it is given by inhalation, and therefore it is carbon dioxide is what we refer to as a diffusion limited gas. A diffusion limited gas. A diffusion limited gas. Carbon monoxide will never reach equilibrium when given by diffusion method, because Hb, hemoglobin, has very high affinity for carbon monoxide. It will bind all carbon monoxide available there, and therefore carbon monoxide will not be left hanging around in plasma freely, and therefore it will never exert a partial pressure, and it will never reach an equilibrium with the blood because all of it is taken up. And therefore, it is limited to reach equilibrium with the blood because for that reason, it is called a diffusion limited gas. Is it clear? I want to hear to see yes or no, whether that point is clear. Yes, it is clear. Yes, it is clear. Yes, it is clear. Thank you very much. One has said, no, it is not clear. Yes, yes, no, yes. I repeat one more because that point is very, very important. For the sake of those who have not understood in the first instance, let me repeat again very quickly for the interest of time. Carbon monoxide is 200 times more, the affinity for hemoglobin to carbon monoxide is 200 times that of oxygen. And whenever it gets into the alveolar, it diffuses rapidly into the blood, and all of it is bound to hemoglobin with no single molecule left hanging in the blood, and therefore does not exert partial pressure because partial pressure is only exerted by the molecules that are hanging freely in the blood, and therefore cannot reach an equilibrium because there is no partial pressure at all. It cannot reach an equilibrium between alveolar and the blood. And we say there is carbon monoxide that is hanging in the blood freely. No, it cannot reach, it is limited therefore to reach equilibrium by diffusion method as long as it's given through inhalation. And therefore carbon monoxide is diffusion limited gas. It is diffusion limited gas, limited to reach equilibrium if given through diffusion method. It is diffusion limited gas. Okay. Very good. Majority have understood that point. Let's move along that line of thinking. Therefore, how do we do DRCO tests? Number one, you give the patient a measured amount of carbon monoxide. Measured, that's the most important. A measured amount of carbon monoxide gas via face mask. Single maximum deep breath to the fullest. Just small amount of carbon monoxide that is measured, that is known, the volume is known, the amount is known. Take a single maximum deep breath to the fullest. Of course, using there's a machine like a spirometer machine that will also be connected to the computer to be able to measure the amount of carbon monoxide given. Ask the patient to hold the breath for 10 seconds, then exhale maximally until the residual volume. Okay, the point is this, tell the patient, the amount given is known and has been recorded in a computer, and you're using a spirometer machine. You'll be able to see the spirometer machine when you come for the experiment or the practical. Tell the patient to breathe in maximally, breathe in as much as you can and hold your breath for 10 seconds. Of course, the equipment will measure the amount of carbon monoxide that goes into the lungs. Then measure the amount of carbon monoxide in the exhaled air, because you tell the patient after 10 seconds, then exhale maximally until the residual volume. Breathe out as much as you can. Then measure the amount of carbon monoxide in the exhaled air. Ignore the dead space. Then compute the amount that diffused. All right. How do you compute the amount that diffused? It is, you knew what you gave before breathing in, then you knew what the patient breathed out, you measured, And therefore the difference is what went into the patient. That amount that went into the patient, the difference, divided by the alveolar carbon monoxide partial pressure, because it's going to be recorded as alveolar carbon monoxide partial pressure. And by so doing, you get the diffusing capacity of carbon monoxide, which is the average diffusing capacity of carbon monoxide in young men at rest. Is a known fact, has been done several times, and has been shown to be 17 milliliter of carbon monoxide per minute per millimeter mercury. 17 ml per minute per milliliter mercury. Note, the amount of carbon dioxide absorbed is determined by 3 factors, which I've talked about. Determined by 1, the amount of blood flowing to the capillary bed, that is perfusion. The more the perfusion, the higher the amount of carbon monoxide that is going to be taken. 2, the surface area available for diffusion. And 3, the AA gradient, A, capital A and small a gradient. When you hear the AA gradient, it means the alveolar partial pressure minus arterial partial pressure. Of course, for carbon monoxide, I've just said that the arterial partial pressure is usually 0 because it will never exert a partial pressure because it's all bound. So AA gradient for carbon monoxide is 0, unless there's a problem, serious problem with the hemoglobin level, and somebody is highly anemic. All right. If somebody is highly anemic, you may have an issue with partial pressures. Okay. Conditions and physiological states that alter DLSO. There are conditions and there are physiologic states that alter the DLCO. There are those that decreases and those that increase it. And you should be aware. Those factors that decrease DLCO include decreased membrane surface area. When you decrease membrane surface area, it means since we are dividing with alveolar partial pressure is going to go up, and therefore the denominator goes up, it decreases the value. 2, increase membrane thickness. The higher the thickness, like in interstitial lung diseases, according to Fick's law, you slow down the rate of diffusion, and the alveolar carbon monoxide partial pressure will be more. And since the denominator in the equation, it decreases the value of DLCO. Pulmonary hypertension, the same pulmonary hypertension has these tendencies of the blood has no enough time to pick up the carbon monoxide, and therefore it is left in the alveolar, and the partial pressure in alveolar increases, and it's a denominator in the equation, and therefore it decreases the factor, the resultant DLCO calculation, and anemia in the same manner. Factor that increases DLCO is exercise. Exercise, when you exercise, more of exercise increases the diffusion capacity of any gas, and therefore decreases the alveolar partial pressure for carbon monoxide. And since the denominator in the equation, it reduces the denominator, and therefore the DLCO as an answer increases. Asthma, the same. Pulmonary hemorrhage, polycythemia. Pulmonary hemorrhage, simply because when you have blood now exposed, it picks carbon monoxide very fast, and therefore increases the DLCO. Polycythemia, when you have mild left heart failure, those factors increases DLCO. I do not want to dwell on these factors because, again, the issue was not is not a pathology class. It's a physiology. Physiology, first of all, you understand the normal. But for this slide, I wanted you to appreciate that there are factors that would decrease DLCO. There are factors that would increase DLCO, which are pathologic and sometimes normal physiology. Okay. Before I go to the facts, let me see the charts. Okay, I like the conversation in the chat, and the good thing is some are asking questions, some are answering the same questions. The question about the diffusion limited gas, I will give you the other aspect of what you call the perfusion limited in a minute. So allow me to give you some facts, and then once I wrap up, you probably have understood clearly the topic. There are some facts I want to give you. One is that the diffusing capacity of oxygen is 1.23 times that of carbon monoxide. We have seen the one for carbon monoxide has been determined, and the value for that is 17 ml per minute per millimeter mercury. Therefore, if the diffusing capacity of oxygen is 1.23 times that of carbon monoxide, the diffusing capacity of oxygen therefore equals to the 17 ml per minute per millimeter mercury times 1.23, and the answer is 21 ml per minute per millimeter mercury. Normal alveolar capillary oxygen gradient during normal quiet breathing is also established to be 11 millimeter mercury. As the normal alveolar capillary oxygen gradient during normal quiet breathing is 11 millimeter mercury. Therefore, the diffusing capacity for oxygen during normal quiet breathing is 11 millimeter mercury multiplied by 21 millimeter mils per minute per millimeter mercury. Millimeter mercury cancels millimeter mercury here, and therefore you get the answer to be 2 ml of oxygen. Right, 2 ml of oxygen. Incidentally, this equal to the rate at which the resting body uses the oxygen, what you call the basal metabolic rate. your BMR is usually around 230 ml. The requirement for oxygen in your body when you are at rest is about 230 ml. Nature has a way of satisfying itself. Can we use oxygen? Or why can't we use oxygen to measure the diffusing capacity of a respiratory membrane? No, we cannot use oxygen. And this is the reason we cannot, because on reaching alveolar, oxygen diffuses and equilibrates with the pulmonary capillary blood within 0.3 seconds. Within 0.3 seconds, oxygen reaches equilibrium with the pulmonary capillary blood. Whereas an average red blood cell takes 0.75 seconds, almost double that time, to pass through the capillary pulmonary bed. That's the rate of perfusion. The normal red blood cells, it is here is average RBC. Average RBC takes 0.5 seconds to pass through the capillary pulmonary bed. That's the rate of perfusion. However, we have seen the oxygen molecule will only take like 0.3 seconds to pass through the pulmonary respiratory membrane and equilibrate with the blood. So there is enough time for the blood staying within the pulmonary capillary bed for it to equilibrate completely, for oxygen to reach an equilibrium with what is in the blood, the oxygen in the blood and the pulmonary capillary bed. And for this reason, therefore, let me read for you this statement. In certain circulatory conditions like severe intense exercise, the rate of perfusion is altered to less than 0.3 seconds. When you are doing exercise, this 0.3 seconds, which we are seeing at the normal resting condition, that oxygen takes to diffuse and equilibrate with pulmonary capillary blood, it becomes even less than 0.3 seconds, and therefore oxygen in this case becomes perfusion limited. What does that mean? It means that it will not reach equilibrium as long as it is given through inhalation. Let me paraphrase this again. Oxygen and carbon dioxide given through inhalation are perfusion limited gas. Perfusion limited gas. I want to take you to what we call diffusion limited gas. First, you understand, we start from there. The diffusion limited gas. You got what I meant by diffusion limited gas is that carbon monoxide it is limited to reach equilibrium by diffusion, because carbon monoxide will bind very quickly to hemoglobin, and therefore it will not exert partial pressure as long as it is rather the diffusion, it is through diffusion, it's through the normal breathing in and out, in and out, in and out. It is limited to reach equilibrium by diffusion. Therefore, it is a diffusion limited gas. All right. Now, when we talk about the perfusion limited gas, what we are saying is this, that there is the amount of blood that you get to the lungs at any given time. There's amount of blood that you get into the lungs at any given time. That is perfusion. And therefore, and you find that oxygen is taking very short time, 0.3, to completely get into the blood and bind into hemoglobin. Whereas that perfusion, the red blood cell is taking 0.75 seconds to pass through. So all the oxygen will have gotten bound to hemoglobin as long as the perfusion is maintained at that normal rate of 0.75 seconds. And therefore, because of that reason, oxygen is limited to get to an equilibrium with the blood through the normal perfusion. So it's a perfusion limited gas. I don't know how that is making sense. I want to pause there so that you think about what I've been saying about the perfusion limited gas and the diffusion limited gas. In fact, it's 12:13. I can give you like a few minutes, take 5 minutes break, think about it so that you appreciate before you go to the next chapter. We have like the next 20 minutes or so. Let's move on, but I'll explain shortly again. I'll paraphrase what I mean by perfusion limited. In short, perfusion limited, let me repeat it, is I've said this, that when you breathe in oxygen, within 0.3 seconds, the oxygen has equilibrated with the blood in the lungs. And it cannot take, the blood cannot take any more because already there's an equilibrium there. It cannot take any more. For it to take any more, unless you increase the blood flow into the lungs, all right? Unless you increase the blood flow into the lungs so that now you take a little bit more of oxygen. Otherwise, if you don't increase the perfusion, then you have reached the maximum, the equilibrium. And therefore, oxygen is perfusion limited gas. I hope it makes sense. The same way with carbon dioxide, it will reach an equilibrium within a very short time after breathing in. And you cannot take any more unless you increase the perfusion so that you take extra more. And therefore, carbon dioxide is also perfusion limited. That's the other way of looking at it. We had talked about diffusion limited. We said carbon monoxide will never reach equilibrium at any given time because the affinity for hemoglobin to carbon monoxide is very high. And therefore, with the same perfusion, you cannot reach equilibrium. You can only reach equilibrium if you increase the diffusion rate, and become diffusion limited. I hope that settles the matter. Okay, if you still have a problem with that understanding, I request that you revisit your textbook or your colleagues who have understood the concept. The concept of perfusion limited, meaning that oxygen has reached an equilibrium very fast, and therefore, unless you increase the blood flow perfusion, then it cannot be taken up any other. So it is perfusion limited. You need to increase perfusion to increase the uptake. Very well. With that, I want us to get to a concept that is very, very important also. That is ventilation perfusion ratio, VQ ratio. Ventilation perfusion ratio, ventilation denoted V is the amount of air traveling to alveolar ready for gas exchange. And perfusion denoted Q is the amount of blood flow to the alveolar. Hypothetically, VQ ratio, ventilation perfusion ratio, can range from 0 to infinity. Why? If there is no ventilation, but there is adequate perfusion, then V is 0 and Q is a number. Any 0 that you divide by any number, the answer is 0. So where there is no ventilation, air is not getting into that alveolar, the VQ ratio of that part is 0. Or just assume the entire lung. You are unable totally to take in air into the lungs, but there is a blood flow for some reason and a certain time. Then there is no ventilation, but there is a perfusion. Therefore, the VQ ratio is 0. On the other hand, if there is air and there is no blood getting to the lungs for some reason, then you have ARV, ventilation, but Q is 0. Any number you divide by 0 is infinity. And that's why I'm saying VQ ratio can range from 0 to infinity. However, under normal circumstances, on average, the amount of air that reaches alveolar for gases exchange is the tidal volume, minus, of course, the dead volume. And the tidal volume minus dead volume gives you the amount of air that takes part in gases exchange, and we call it alveolar ventilation. Therefore, alveolar ventilation is a tidal volume minus dead space volume. 500 ml minus 150 ml, 350 ml. That is the alveolar ventilation, amount of air that will get into the lungs, into the respiratory zone for gases exchange with single breath. But you have about 15 breaths per minute. 15 breaths per minute. Therefore, alveolar ventilation, if you multiply by the rate of breathing, 15 minutes per breath, it gives you what we call alveolar minute ventilation. And the alveolar minute ventilation is therefore 4,200 ml of air per minute that takes part in gases exchange. Note this, the rate of perfusion, on the other hand, is a stroke volume times the heart rate. This is times the heart rate. Stroke volume times the heart rate give us the cardiac output. Stroke volume is that amount of blood that the heart pumps out per a single stroke, times the heart rate is the cardiac output, and we know cardiac output for a normal physiologic man is about 5,200 ml of blood per minute. Therefore, roughly the FQ ratio is 4,200 ml of air divided by 5,200 ml of blood and is equal to 0.8. On average, the FQ ratio of a normal subject is 0.8 for that reason. However, remember I said this about the zones of the lung, zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. Because of those zones, there's something we call FQ mismatch. Because the blood flow is not the same in all the 3 zones. There's something we call the FQ mismatch. How? 1, throughout the lungs, ventilation and perfusion differs in the 3 zones I talked about. And 2, in some lung diseases can further affect FQ ratio. When you're in upright position, you experience the 3 zones. 1, both ventilation and perfusion are greater at the base of the lungs. That one I discussed yesterday. Both ventilation and perfusion are greater at the base of the lung. At the apex of the lungs, the apices, the superior part of the lung, you have large alveolar and the decreased pulmonary intravascular pressure due to the less blood flowing, hence less perfusion. There is also less ventilation because of large alveolar with less compliance. For that reason, you have not so good ventilation and pretty bad perfusion at the apex of the lungs. You have not so good ventilation and pretty bad perfusion. At the base of the lungs, you have smaller size alveolar attributed to the difference in interpleural pressure, and you have more blood flowing, therefore more perfusion and more ventilation because alveolar are able to expand more. The differences are found in a normal person and is due to gravity hydrostatic forces in upright position. When you lie supine posture, I talked about zone conversion and you overcome the issue of the 3 zones. So what does this one represent? It shows that even if we have calculated and we have seen the FQ ratio to be 0.8 in a normal subject, it is not 0.8 in all the 3 zones. What happens is this, that zone 1, remember with the wasted ventilation, zone 2 and zone 3 wasted perfusion. This is what happens. We have here ventilation that is not good, and perfusion that is very, very poor. Therefore, the VQ ratio is such that V, one arrow, meaning is not good. Q, perfusion, two arrows, meaning is very, very poor. Then VQ ratio is that you have a number that you divide by a very huge number. So you get an answer like 0.05, thereabout, 0.03 to 0.05 around the top here, because the perfusion is very, very poor. And the ventilation is also poor. When you come to the down here, sorry, it's the opposite, sorry. Allow me to repeat this, starting from down here. Down here, we said there is a good, very good perfusion, Q, and aeration is also good. The arrow up is showing is good. Ventilation is good, and perfusion is very, very good. And therefore, because perfusion Q is very high compared to ventilation, then the number is small. You are dividing a number that is good by a very huge number, and you get a result. The VQ ratio at the base of the lungs will be a smaller number than 0.8. It comes to about 0.3 to 0.5 thereabout. On the contrary, here, VQ ratio usually goes past 3. It's about 3 and above, because you are dividing a ventilation with a very small number that represents small perfusion, and you get a higher number like 3. At the middle here, you almost get a perfect match of 1, the VQ ratio of about 1. But when you mix everything, you get an average, you get a VQ ratio of 0.8, being an average. That's an important concept I wanted you. The VQ ratio in a normal physiologic man is about 0.8, the one you have seen in the previous slide. It's about 0.8 for this reason. However, because of the different zones, the base of the lungs having very good perfusion and also good ventilation, you divide a number here with a huge number that is ventilation, you get about 0.3 to 0.5. Here is almost equal, ventilation, perfusion, you get 1. Here, the ventilation is okay, not so good, but the perfusion is even worse, very, very small. So small denominator, the answer becomes huge, like 3. So you get answer VQ ratio of 3, VQ ratio of 1, VQ ratio of 0.3. When you do the average, you get an average VQ ratio of about 0.8. Lung diseases conditions altering VQ ratio. Lung diseases that lowers or reduces the VQ ratio, they do so by reducing ventilation. One of it is pneumonia. Because of lung consolidation, there is less ventilation, and when ventilation, the V is more, the VQ ratio is a small value. COPD, that is chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, the same way. Like bronchitis, it reduces bronchial aperture and the mucus clogging, reduces ventilation, leading to reduced VQ ratio. Pulmonary edema, fluid overload in the lungs, it reduces ventilation and the VQ ratios go down. There are diseases that increases VQ ratio by reducing perfusion. you reduce the perfusion, the denominator, of course, the VQ ratio will seem to go up. One again is COPD. COPD is in both, but in this case, COPD can cause destruction of pulmonary capillary supplying the alveoli, hence reduces perfusion. And at that point, that is the terminal end of bronchitis, for example. The terminal end result of long-term COPD is destruction of pulmonary capillary supplying alveoli, and therefore it reduces perfusion. And when you reduce perfusion, the VQ ratio starts going up. Initially, during COPD, is the decreased ventilation causing decreased VQ ratio. Then we have pulmonary embolism. Embolism, those are blood clots occluding the pulmonary artery, leading to compromised perfusion. When perfusion, the Q goes down in the equation, the VQ ratio start going up because the ratio. The denominator is decreasing, and therefore, when you maintain the ventilation and perfusion is decreasing, so what you have is that you increase the VQ ratio. VQ ratio mismatch spectrum. I've indicated that the VQ ratio can range from 0 to infinity. 0 is when ventilation, when there is no ventilation, but there is perfusion. So V is 0, the numerator is 0, but the denominator is there, so the answer is 0. That is perfusion without ventilation. This represents a wasted perfusion because the blood is going there, but it's not picking anything, and is also referred to as absolute physiologic shunt. Absolute physiologic shunt, and the VQ ratio can be 1 where there is normal ventilation and there is normal perfusion that equalize one another, and you get 1. Then the VQ ratio, and this is ideal, but we have seen in a normal person, it is never 1, it is 0.8, as we've calculated. The VQ ratio can also be on the extreme side where there is ventilation, but there is no perfusion. So V, ventilation is there, but Q is 0. And any number you divide by 0 is infinity. And this represents wasted ventilation. You are wasting ventilation because blood is not flowing there to pick oxygen. It's a wasted ventilation, and it's also referred to as absolute physiologic dead space. Physiologic dead space. Remember, I had talked about anatomic dead space, the area between the nose and the terminal bronchi where gases exchange do not take place. That is anatomic dead space. But this is a physiologic dead space, absolute physiologic dead space. You have air, but ventilation is not taking place because blood is not flowing. And this is an area where ideally you should be having gases exchange. It constitutes absolute physiologic dead space. And therefore the spectrum of VQ mismatch during a line comes from infinity, where from 0 to infinity. 0 is where there is no ventilation. Ventilation is 0, but there is perfusion. It's absolute physiologic shunt. You go to the other extreme where you have ventilation, but you have no perfusion, and therefore that's an absolute physiologic dead space. Absolute physiologic shunt, perfusion, but without ventilation, the answer is 0. Absolute physiologic dead space, ventilation, but no perfusion, the VQ ratio is infinity. Ideal would be 1, but under normal circumstances, you find more, it has come to 0.8 because what we breathe in is 4,200 milliliters of air, and the cardiac output is 5,200 milliliters of air. The VQ ratio at the normal circumstances is 0.8. One would be ideal. So the spectrum is from 0 to infinity. That's what we call VQ ratio mismatch spectrum. And I come to the end of our lecture today. Next week, we'll talk about blood gas transport. In the meantime, I'll check on the comments. If you are satisfied, I don't have a problem. You can be leaving. For those who want to go for prayers, if I read that I see there is need, I'll repeat some areas. All right. I'm reading your comments. 0.8 is an average, Yama. Yes, it is an average. That not zone 1 though. Strictly speaking, VQ ratio at the apex is 0. VQ ratio at the apex is 0. It cannot be 0. It cannot be 0 because remember, at a given time, I had said there's an area with no blood flow. All right. The instances you find there's no blood flow at all in the apex, and therefore the VQ ratio at that point in time becomes infinity. But most of the time, these zones, remember I said they fluctuate. You get the zone of intermittent blood flow, and you get those figures are talking about 3 point something, 3.0, 3.8. But as you go down, it goes decreasing because you have very good ventilation at the base. And when you have a large denominator, then the VQ ratio becomes a smaller value, like 0.3. Zone 1 is 3.8, zone 2 is 1, zone 3 is about 2.5. That's correct, Kevin. Kervis Maranga. And remember, those zones are not anatomic zones, they are physiologic zones, and they do change. They change once in a while slightly, so they are not fixed. That's an idea that you should have about the zones and how they behave in terms of VQ ratios. Zone 1, there is high ventilation and the lead through perfusion. That's why VQ ratio is higher. That's correct, Mesha Kruter. Zone 1 has reduced perfusion, no perfusion. True. Some comments are just interesting comment, but it's all right. It's good to enjoy a lecture. So I can see we still have a number 3.1. What there is, I think I'll add there. I'll ask you to also revisit your guide. There is a lot to read. What we do as lecturer, we set the tempo, we introduce the area properly, then go into the depth. Right away after this, or during your self-study time in the evening, have a look at what I've taken you through. It is all in your textbook, but to make it easier now for you to read and understand in a better way. I cannot pray that I've been able to give you everything, but at least I've been able to guide you into the area that I think are relevant, important for your next level when you start doing pathophysiology and pathology and as you move along. So for now, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll end there, and I wish you a good afternoon, and we meet next time. We talk about blood gas transport. Thank you very much.